Did your family have favorites? If so, were you the favorite or someone else?
At the family barbecue, over grilled corn, iced beers, and half-burnt hot dogs, my mom stood under the patio string lights like she was on stage, glass of Cabernet in her hand, and decided, in front of everyone, to finally say the thing I always suspected she believed and never dared say out loud until that moment. "You're just not wife material like your sister," she said, loud enough that even my Uncle Dean, who's been mostly deaf since '97, turned his head from the grill. No one said a word. Not my dad, who just poked the ribs like nothing happened. Not my cousin Angela, who looked like she wanted to crawl into the potato salad bowl and disappear. Not even Ashley, my perfect little sister, who just bit her lip like she wasn't sure if she should be flattered or mortified. I didn't say anything either. I stood there with an empty plate in my hand and a lukewarm deviled egg sliding around on it, pretending that what she said didn't hit me in the throat like a punch from someone I never saw coming. The thing about words like that is they don't come out of nowhere. They've been sitting there, boiling under the surface for years, maybe decades, waiting for just the right moment to rise up and ruin something. And for her, that moment was right after the second round of drinks and before dessert. I forced a smile that felt more like biting a bullet and said, "Well, somebody's gotta clean up," and I started picking up everyone's damn plates while my mother moved on to telling Aunt Cheryl about how Ashley's wedding planner is just to die for, and how she hopes they pick Napa for the reception because it's just so classic. It wasn't the first time she'd compared us. Not by a long shot. But something about the way she said it this time, like it was some kind of joke, like it was common knowledge, and she was just the first brave enough to say it out loud, made something shift in me. I wasn't even angry. Not then. Not yet. I was just done. I cleared the plates. All of them. I scrubbed the grill tray even though it wasn't mine. I packed up the leftovers in the 2 small Tupperware containers that never really seal right. I folded the damn tablecloth. And I did it all while people awkwardly avoided my eyes and kept up small talk like we were in the middle of a tense hostage situation and no one wanted to make any sudden moves. When it was all cleaned up, I walked over to my dad, who was still poking at the ribs like maybe they'd resurrect themselves and fix the night, and I kissed him on the cheek. "Thanks for dinner," I said. He gave me that half shrug he always does when something goes wrong, and he pretends he's not part of it, even though he's been part of it for 40+ years now. "You know how she gets," he mumbled, eyes still on the grill. I didn't answer. I just grabbed my keys and left. No slamming doors. No tears. No screaming. Just gone. Because here's the thing, when you've spent almost 4 decades being compared to someone who could do no wrong, you get good at hiding the burn. You get good at turning pain into silence. And silence, real, deliberate silence, is a hell of a weapon when used right. By the time I pulled out of the driveway, the laughter had started again. My mother had moved on. So had everyone else. The only person who texted me that night was my cousin Angela, who said, "Hey, that was messed up. You okay?" I didn't respond. Not because I wasn't okay, but because I realized I didn't owe anyone anything anymore, especially not my mother. That was Friday. Yesterday, on Sunday, my sister messaged me. "What happened?" "Mom's locked herself in her room." And let me tell you, I laughed. I laughed like I hadn't in years, the kind of laugh that feels sharp and dangerous, the kind you don't recognize as your own. Because suddenly I realized that whatever storm was happening in that house, I didn't have to be under its roof anymore. I didn't reply to Ashley either. Not yet. Because I knew something she didn't. Mom locking herself in her room wasn't the problem. The problem was that, for the first time, she said the quiet part out loud, and the silence she got back from me was louder than anything she expected. But here's what I want to know, and maybe you've seen this too. Have you ever been compared to someone your whole life and made to feel like you were just the leftover option? What would you do if your own mother said that to your face in front of your family? Would you scream? Cry? Or would you walk away like I did and let the silence do the talking? Because the next move? That was mine. And it sure as hell wasn't going to be as polite as clearing the dinner table. There's a certain kind of silence that settles in after a family explosion, not the peaceful kind, but a brittle, Dangerous quiet, like the moment after a glass shatters on tile. When everyone just stares and no one knows what to say because they're waiting to see if the pieces will cut someone. That's what the weekend felt like after I left the barbecue. I didn't hear from my mom, of course, and I didn't expect to. She was never the type to apologize, not even when she ran over my bike when I was 9 and blamed me for leaving it behind the car like an idiot. That was just her way. Everything was always someone else's fault, usually mine, and she always made sure I knew where I stood in her pecking order, which was precisely one rung below whoever was currently pleasing her the most. And that was almost always my sister. Ashley had been the golden child since birth, the one with dimples and charm, and that effortless ability to be liked in every room she entered. I was the one with glasses, too many books, and a stubborn streak that got me labeled as difficult by the time I was old enough to speak my mind. Growing up, everything I did was either not enough or too much. When I won the science fair in 8th grade, my mom said, "That's great, sweetie, but don't you think boys will think you're a little too smart?" When I got accepted to a college out of state on a full scholarship, she called it cute, but warned me not to get weird or come back all feminist and angry. Ashley, meanwhile, got a standing ovation for remembering to send birthday cards. I used to think that maybe she didn't mean it, that maybe she just didn't know how her words landed, but as I got older, I started to realize she knew exactly what she was doing. It wasn't just favoritism, it was a performance, a constant comparison where I was cast as the supporting act to Ashley's lead role. And no matter how far I distanced myself, no matter how much I accomplished on my own, I could never seem to shed the label of the other one. That Monday morning, I didn't check my phone until almost 10, and even then I didn't feel the usual anxiety I used to get after family drama, the kind where you brace for a guilt trip text or a phone call disguised as concern but soaked in manipulation. Instead, I sat on my balcony, drank coffee that was already cold, and watched the city move beneath me like I wasn't part of it. When I finally opened my phone, there were 3 unread messages from Ashley. The first said, "What happened?" The second said, "Why did you leave like that?" And the third, sent almost a full day later, simply read, "Mom's locked herself in her room and won't talk to anyone. Dad says she's been crying all day. What did you say to her?" That last one made me pause, not because I felt guilty, but because it was so perfectly Ashley to assume that I must have done something, that my reaction, my quiet exit, was more damaging than the words our mother actually said out loud in front of a patio full of people. And for a moment, just one bitter second, I almost typed back, "What did I say?" I said thank you and left. Maybe you should ask what she said. But I didn't. Because Ashley didn't want truth. She wanted peace, a restored sense of control, and a quick path back to normal. And I wasn't interested in playing that part anymore. Instead, I opened a drawer I hadn't touched in years, one that still smelled faintly of dust and old printer ink, and pulled out a folder with my handwriting on the tab, Daniel, 2015. It had been almost a decade since I'd last looked at it, and for a while, I convinced myself I never would. But the moment I opened it, the smell hit me first, faint cigarette smoke and cologne, like it had trapped a piece of the past between the pages. There were printed emails, some screenshots, and a letter, one I hadn't written, but one I had discovered a year too late. Daniel was my fiancé once. We'd met when I was 26, and for a brief period of time, I believed that maybe I'd finally broken through whatever curse had followed me since birth. He wasn't perfect, but he was steady, kind, curious about my world, and most importantly, he saw me as something more than just not Ashley. We got engaged after 2 years, and I remember the day clearly, not because of the proposal, but because of what came after. Within a month, everything fell apart. Daniel started pulling away. He canceled plans. He ghosted conversations. He showed up late to dinner one night and said, without emotion, "I can't do this. I think we want different things." And then he left. Just like that. No fight. No tears. No cheating scandal or betrayal I could point to. Just silence. At the time, I thought maybe I had done something wrong, pushed too hard, loved too much, scared him off with my ambition or my questions. I never asked him for more than honesty, and I didn't even get that. But a year later, during a messy inbox cleanup, I found a forwarded email that had been accidentally sent to my work account, one between my mother and Daniel, dated 2 weeks before he left. It wasn't long, just a few lines, but enough to snap something inside me forever. If you care about her, really care, you'll walk away now before she gets too deep. She's not like Ashley. She's complicated. She needs therapy, not marriage. Don't ruin your life. I'm saying this for your good and hers. I never confronted her about it. What would have been the point? She would have denied it, said it was fake, claimed I misread it, or spun it into some twisted narrative about how she was only trying to protect me. That's what she always did, took the knife, plunged it in, and then acted shocked when you bled. But I kept the letter. Not because I planned to use it, but because I needed to remind myself that I wasn't crazy, that the loss I'd grieved for wasn't entirely mine to carry. And now, all these years later, it felt like it was finally time to let someone else read it. I picked up the phone and called a number I hadn't dialed since my early 30s, a private investigator I'd used for a job I didn't take. "Do you still have the backup of the 2015 folder?" I asked, my voice calm. The pause on the line was short but deliberate. "I do. You sure you want it?" I smiled, not because I was happy, but because I finally felt like the weight I'd been dragging behind me had a direction. "Yeah," I said. "It's time." And as I hung up, I knew this wasn't just about a mother's cruelty anymore. This was about taking back the story she tried to write for me and burning the damn script. The envelope was heavier than I remembered, though maybe that was just the weight of all the years it had spent sealed away, tucked inside a fireproof box in a closet I swore I'd never open again, not because I forgot what was inside, but because I knew the moment I saw it again, the version of myself who had tried to let go would vanish, replaced by someone who had unfinished business with people who believed they were untouchable. The package came with no return address, just like I asked, and the handwriting on the label looked nothing like the clean, practiced script my mother used when she sent her passive-aggressive Christmas cards, full of news about Ashley's career advancements and wedding planning updates, but never a single line about what I was doing, as if my life had stopped being worth mentioning after Daniel disappeared and I didn't follow the path she laid out for me. Inside, the folder was just as I remembered, marked with Daniel's name, followed by the year that should have been mine. The first few pages were the surveillance summaries, nothing illegal, just detailed. Places he went, people he met, conversations he had in public. It was the kind of thing you only resort to when you're more desperate for the truth than your dignity can handle, and back then, I was both. I needed to know why a man who once kissed my forehead in the middle of a traffic jam and promised me a life full of quiet mornings and loyalty had suddenly decided to vanish like a guest at a party he never wanted to attend. What I didn't expect, what I still sometimes find hard to believe, even after reading the evidence 100 times, was that the answer wasn't in his choices, but in someone else's voice whispering behind the scenes, convincing him that I wasn't worth the risk. The letter from my mother wasn't long. It didn't need to be. Her words had always been sharp and clean, like the blade of a knife that didn't need a serrated edge to do damage. She told Daniel that I was unstable, too intense, too focused, that I would eventually resent him for not matching my ambition, that Ashley, by contrast, would be his soft place to land if he wanted a life without drama. She made it sound like a kindness, as though she was offering him a lifeboat while I was still dancing on the deck of a sinking ship, blissfully unaware that the water was already up to my knees. She framed it like protection, like maternal instinct, like honesty, and he believed her. That much became clear in the emails he sent to a friend just days before he broke up with me, where he said, "Her mom made me see it. That's not marriage material. She'll never be happy with someone like me." I'd just hold her back. That sentence, that stupid, gutless sentence stayed with me long after the heartbreak wore off. It made me question whether every person I'd loved after Daniel had seen the same invisible warning label on me. Too much. Not enough. Complicated. It also made me hate the idea that someone else had been writing my story without my permission. Now, with the files back in my possession, I knew it wasn't just about closure anymore. It was about the fact that Ashley was about to marry this man. That she had no idea what he'd done, who he'd done it to, or how easily he could be manipulated. And if I said nothing, I'd be doing the same thing my mother did to me, letting a life-altering truth stay buried in the name of keeping the peace. I wasn't going to let that happen. I printed one of the screenshots, just one, and folded it into a blank envelope, along with a single sheet of paper on which I wrote, in black ink, the kind that doesn't smudge or fade, if your fiancé loved someone before you. Would you want to know how he left her? Would you want to know who told him to leave? No signature. No name. Just the truth hanging like a trapdoor. I dropped it in Ashley's mailbox after dark, walking through the neighborhood I hadn't stepped foot in since Christmas Eve 2 years ago, when my mother smiled across the dinner table and asked me if I'd gained weight or if it was just the sweater. The street was quiet, but I moved fast, not out of fear, but because I didn't want to be seen, not yet. I wasn't hiding. I was waiting. Waiting for the truth to bloom, slowly and painfully, in the middle of their carefully curated engagement. The next day, I didn't hear anything, which didn't surprise me. Ashley had always been the type to process things in silence before reacting. She was taught, as I was, that emotional outbursts made you look weak, and being weak was something our mother never tolerated unless you were doing it to get attention at the right time. But by the following evening, I saw a status update vanish from her Facebook, the one with the engagement photos and the caption about "Forever starting soon." And that, to me, said more than any phone call could. I sat on my couch, the folder open in front of me, rereading the last page, which wasn't part of the investigator's report, but something I had added later. It was a list. A list of things my mother had said to me over the years that I had never responded to, not because I didn't have the words, but because I knew she wouldn't hear them. Men don't like women who talk too much. Ashley has a softer energy. It's just more appealing. You'll understand when you're older. Don't be dramatic. It's not always about you. Line after line of dismissals disguised as advice, all of them carefully worded to sound like concern, but designed to make me smaller. Now, for the first time, I felt like I wasn't small anymore. Letting Ashley learn the truth was never about revenge, not really. It was about breaking a cycle, about refusing to let the same manipulation take down someone else just because they were too close to see it. And if Ashley chose to ignore the letter, to pretend it never came, that was her choice. But at least I had given her one. I knew it was only a matter of time before the call came. Or the confrontation. Or the silence that meant she'd chosen a side. But this time, I wasn't waiting to be hurt. This time, I was already standing. There is a strange kind of power in watching people unravel not through confrontation, not through explosions or screaming matches or slammed doors, but through the slow, creeping realization that the story they've always believed, the one they were handed, nurtured, and defended was never true to begin with, and that some part of them always knew it, deep down, but chose to ignore it because comfort is easier than clarity, and denial is a softer pillow than truth will ever be. That's exactly what was happening to Ashley in the days after I dropped that letter in her mailbox, and even without speaking to her, without hearing her voice or seeing her face, I could feel the ripple of it reaching me like an aftershock, small at first, barely noticeable, but growing stronger every day as the lie she'd been living cracked open under the weight of something too real to ignore. She didn't reply. Not immediately. That wasn't her way. Ashley had always been the kind of person who polished her emotions before presenting them to the world, like they were silverware meant for display, never use. And I knew she'd go through every possible explanation before landing on the one she didn't want to believe, that our mother had interfered, not just once, not just subtly, but deliberately, with intent, and with the precision of someone who'd been orchestrating things behind the scenes for years. And the man she was about to marry wasn't just the victim of circumstance or miscommunication, but someone who willingly participated in that manipulation because it suited him at the time and because he, like so many others, saw me as dispensable once a more agreeable option appeared. The first real sign came when the engagement photos disappeared from social media. At first, just the profile picture, then the album, then the hashtag she'd carefully crafted for the wedding that now led to nothing but broken links and digital silence. It was subtle, almost surgical, and if you didn't know Ashley like I did, you might have missed it. But I knew that this wasn't hesitation or second thoughts. It was retreat. It was damage control. And when she finally called, just past midnight on a Wednesday, her voice was tighter than I'd ever heard it, like she'd been holding it all together with balled fists for days and was starting to lose her grip. "I need to ask you something," she said, not even bothering to pretend this was a casual call. I didn't respond right away. I let the silence hang there, let her fill the space with her own breath, her own doubt, her own unraveling. "Did he really? Was it really, Mom?" she asked finally, her voice cracking just slightly at the end, not from emotion, but from restraint, because Ashley was raised, like me, in a house where crying was a performance, not a reaction. And if it wasn't going to serve a purpose, it was better left behind closed doors. "Yes," I said, simply and without apology. She didn't say anything for a moment. Then, quieter, "Why didn't you tell me back then? Would you have believed me?" I asked, not cruelly, but honestly, because the truth was Ashley wouldn't have believed me, not at 28, not when she was still wrapped in the fantasy that our mother was difficult, but well-meaning, that I was sensitive, that things just happened and weren't caused. "I don't know," she said, which was the first real thing she'd said all night. The next day, she came by my apartment, which surprised me more than the call had, because Ashley doesn't do unannounced, and she especially doesn't do messy conversations in unfamiliar places. But there she was, standing in my doorway, eyes rimmed with the kind of exhaustion that doesn't come from lack of sleep, but from the collapse of something you thought would hold. She didn't hug me. She didn't sit. She just stood there and said, "She told him I wasn't like you. That I was safe. That I wouldn't challenge him." She framed it like I was an asset, not a person. "He told me that yesterday." "She's always seen us like that," I said. "Not as daughters. As roles." Ashley shook her head, not in disagreement, but in disbelief. And I bought into it. I let her script my whole damn life because I thought if I did it right, she'd stop comparing us. I thought I could win. "You were never supposed to win," I said. "You were just supposed to be obedient." We didn't say much else that night. She left after only a few minutes, and I didn't stop her. I knew she needed to go back, to sit with it, to let the silence press into her skin the way it had pressed into mine all those years ago when I found that letter and realized I wasn't crazy, I wasn't broken, and I wasn't unloved. I was simply inconvenient. But 2 days later, I showed up at my parents' house. Not to cause a scene, not to air grievances, but to do what no one ever expected of me, to be civil, to be calm, to be calculated in the way that only someone who's been wounded deeply enough can manage. I brought banana bread, the same kind I used to bake for my mom when I was 17 and trying to get her attention without asking for it. The kind she used to eat absent-mindedly while flipping through magazines and commenting on Ashley's hair, or her new sweater, or her latest drama, never once asking me how school was, or how I felt about anything at all. She opened the door looking thinner than I remembered, her skin pale, her eyes rimmed with fatigue that seemed more emotional than physical. I held out the bread. "Thought you might like this," I said, like we were neighbors, not blood. She took it, hesitantly, and stepped aside to let me in. The house smelled the same, lavender and lemon cleaner, mixed with the faint scent of old perfume, and nothing inside had changed. Not the photos, not the furniture, not even the chipped vase in the entryway that she refused to throw out because flaws give things character. I sat down in the kitchen where so many of our battles had been silently waged, across mugs of coffee and beneath veils of pleasantries, and I looked her in the eye. "You always wanted Ashley to win," I said. "You just never noticed what the game was." She didn't respond. She looked away, down at the bread, as if it held the answer to a question she hadn't yet dared to ask. I didn't stay long. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't demand apologies. I simply stood, walked to the door, and let myself out. Because sometimes, the loudest revenge isn't fury, it's clarity. And I wanted her to sit in it. To feel the silence I had lived with for so long, finally mirrored back at her. Not as punishment, but as truth. There's a moment, after a structure collapses, when the dust still hangs in the air, thick and motionless, and for a brief, while it almost seems peaceful until you realize that what you're breathing in isn't just air, but the remains of everything that used to hold the walls together. That's what the days after my visit felt like. Not a storm, not a fire, not an earthquake, but the stillness after all three, where the silence itself hums with destruction and no one knows yet which pieces are salvageable and which ones are beyond repair. And in that stillness, in that deeply uncomfortable, unfamiliar quiet where my family usually filled space with noise and gossip and little white lies dressed as laughter, the truth finally had room to breathe. It didn't take long for Ashley to call off the engagement, and though I wasn't there for it, I didn't need to be. The ripples made their way to me through muted voicemails, passive-aggressive group chat silence, and one accidental screenshot sent by our cousin Cheryl, who meant to send it to someone else, but ended up sending it to me, which showed Ashley's Facebook post, time-stamped at 3 in the morning, announcing in a clipped and uncharacteristically cold tone that she and Daniel had amicably parted ways and were choosing to focus on their individual futures with respect and privacy. I could see right through it, of course. Ashley didn't do amicable. Ashley did perfection. And the public ending of a fairy tale engagement meant more than just personal heartbreak. It meant the collapse of an identity she'd been curating for years, a carefully constructed life built on the belief that she was the chosen one, the one who could make the right decisions, attract the right man, and build the kind of life that people envied, while I was left wandering somewhere on the margins, clever but alone, accomplished but unloved, the cautionary tale her friends whispered about at wine nights. When the engagement fell apart, my mother unraveled in a way none of us expected. Not loud, not dramatic, not full of righteous indignation or tears thrown for sympathy. Instead, she simply stopped moving. According to Ashley, she stayed in her room for almost 2 days straight, curtains drawn, lights off, the television left on a news station with the volume low enough to be ignored. She didn't eat much. She didn't answer texts. She only opened the door to take in her coffee and medication, and even that, according to my father, was done without a word. It wasn't guilt. At least, not the kind that brings apologies or revelations or healing. It was something colder, more wounded. As if the story she had written for herself, about her daughters, about control, about who she was and how she raised us, had finally collapsed under the weight of its own falsehoods, and she didn't know how to exist without it. I didn't visit right away. I let her sit in it. I let the silence she had built around us for years echo back into her own space until maybe, just maybe, she understood what it felt like to be dismissed so completely that your very presence became an inconvenience. But when the hospital called 2 days later, something about a panic episode and high blood pressure, and how she had refused to let them contact anyone else, I went. Not out of love, not exactly, but out of something deeper, something rooted in the complicated soil of family obligation and unresolved grief, and the need to look someone in the eye when they're at their weakest, and still not offer them the comfort they once denied you. She looked smaller in the hospital bed, almost shrunken by the fluorescent light and the institutional white of the sheets. Her hair was disheveled, her face bare, and the sharpness that usually danced in her eyes like sparks off a live wire was gone, replaced by something dull and fragile. She didn't speak when I entered. She didn't look surprised. It was as if she had expected me, not because she believed I'd come out of kindness, but because she knew I would want to see it, to see the queen without her crown, the matriarch without her mask. I sat down beside her, slowly, not out of hesitation, but out of calculation, letting the weight of the moment sink in before I opened my mouth. She didn't look at me. She stared ahead, as though I were just another nurse, another blur of motion she couldn't control. You know, I said, keeping my voice low but firm, I spent years wondering what was wrong with me, why I couldn't hold a man, why I was always the backup plan, the second choice, the not quite right daughter. She flinched, just barely. And then I realized it wasn't about what I was lacking. It was about what you refused to see. Still no response. Just that same vacant stare. You said I wasn't wife material, I continued, but what you really meant was, I wasn't your idea of what a woman should be. I didn't bend. I didn't smile through my teeth. I didn't pretend. And that scared you. Finally, her eyes met mine. Tired. Hollow. But alert. You don't understand, she whispered, the words brittle like old leaves. I was trying to protect you. I wanted you to have a different kind of life. No, I said, shaking my head, you wanted me to have your kind of life. You wanted me to fit into a version of womanhood you could control, because if I didn't, it meant you failed. There was nothing left to say after that, and I didn't wait for an apology that would never come. I stood, adjusted my bag, and left her there, not out of cruelty, but out of the understanding that sometimes walking away is the most merciful thing you can do when someone has spent their whole life trying to clip your wings. Months passed. Seasons turned. Ashley stayed quiet, retreating into some new version of herself that I could only glimpse through occasional messages and polite family updates. She sent me a card on my birthday. I sent her a photo of my new apartment. We were cautious, not because we didn't care, but because we were both still learning how to breathe outside the narrative we were raised inside. And then, one morning, a plain envelope appeared in my mailbox. No return address. No markings. Inside was a single sheet of paper, handwritten in a familiar, sharp cursive that had once scrawled notes on my high school essays and left grocery lists on the fridge. You ruined everything. I hope it was worth it. There was no signature. There didn't need to be. I folded it neatly, placed it in a drawer filled with other unspoken truths, and closed it with a finality that felt less like an ending and more like a seal. Maybe I wasn't wife material. Maybe I never would be. But I was something else entirely now, someone who no longer needed to beg for approval or compete for affection, or keep bleeding just to keep someone else comfortable. And if the silence left behind was louder than anything that came before it, then so be it. Because in the end, the only thing more powerful than a family's judgment is a woman who finally stops asking for permission to be whole.